Most people see Biltmore as a fairy tale palace in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 175,000 square feet of limestone luxury built for pleasure and permanence. But from the day it opened in 1895, this house bled money, consumed forests, and tied hundreds of workers to a private experiment that nearly destroyed the Vanderbilt fortune. Behind its 250 rooms were debts, deaths, and decisions that pushed the estate to the brink more than once. This is the story of how America's largest mansion survived 130 years, not because it was untouchable. Instead, it was forced to change. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born into a family that owned more wealth than most nations. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built a railroad and shipping empire that made the family name synonymous with American industrial power. By the time George was born in 1862, the Vanderbilts controlled nearly 1% of all the money in the United States. But George was different. While his brothers pursued business and his cousins built ostentatious mansions along Fifth Avenue, George preferred books. He spoke 8 languages. He collected art. He traveled Europe studying architecture and absorbing the refinement of old-world estates. He was a quiet man in a loud family, and perhaps that's why he needed Biltmore. In 1888, at age 26, George visited Asheville, North Carolina. The town sat in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains, a landscape of rolling forests and clean air that attracted wealthy Northerners seeking escape from industrial cities. George saw something more than a vacation spot. He saw a canvas. Within months, he began purchasing land, not acres, entire mountains. By 1891, he owned 125,000 acres of western North Carolina, an area larger than the entire city of Denver. This would not be a summer cottage. This would be a statement. George hired Richard Morris Hunt, America's most prestigious architect, the man who had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty and the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Hunt had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and understood European grandeur better than anyone in America. The directive was clear. Build a French Renaissance chateau. Make it larger than anything in the United States. Make it permanent. Hunt delivered plans for a structure that defied American sensibility: 4 acres of floor space, a banquet hall with a 70-foot vaulted ceiling, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a library designed to hold 23s and volumes, 250 rooms in total. The foundation alone required a private railroad to transport Indiana limestone, millions of bricks fired on site, and steel beams shipped from Pittsburgh. Construction crews worked in shifts around the clock. George also hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park. Olmsted was 66 years old and already legendary. His task at Biltmore was equally ambitious: transform raw Appalachian wilderness into a designed landscape that would rival the great estates of Europe. Olmsted planted thousands of trees. He built miles of carriage roads. He created a 250-acre park surrounding the house, with vistas carefully calculated to frame distant mountain views. But Olmsted saw a problem. The land George had purchased was exhausted. Decades of logging and farming had stripped the soil. Erosion carved gashes into hillsides. If nothing changed, the forests would vanish entirely within a generation. So Olmsted proposed something radical: scientific forestry. George agreed. He hired Gifford Pinchot, a young forester trained in Europe, to manage the woodlands. Later, Pinchot would become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. At Biltmore, he pioneered the idea that forests could be harvested sustainably, cut selectively rather than clear-cut. It was an experiment on a scale never attempted in America. The house itself rose slowly. Stonemasons carved limestone gargoyles and Gothic details by hand. Craftsmen installed Renoir paintings and Dürer prints. The library received a ceiling painting by the 18th century Italian artist Giovanni Pellegrini, purchased and shipped from a Venetian palace. George spared no expense because expense, to him, was irrelevant. By 1895, the house was functional, though not finished. George invited family and friends to celebrate Christmas Eve. They arrived by train, then by carriage along Olmsted's winding approach road, designed to build anticipation with each turn. And then the house revealed itself. Guests entered through massive oak doors into a limestone entrance hall, rising 3 stories. Ahead, a grand staircase spiraled upward beneath a vaulted ceiling. To the right, the banquet hall stretched like a cathedral, its walls lined with Flemish tapestries and medieval flags. This was not a home. This was a monument. The house had no mortgage. George owned it outright, along with every acre surrounding it. He had created a private kingdom where he controlled the land, the labor, and the legacy. That Christmas Eve, candles glowed in every window. The estate staff, dressed in livery, served a feast on china and silver imported from Europe. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains stood silent under winter stars. The dream was complete, or so it seemed. What none of the guests could see, what perhaps even George had not fully calculated, was the machinery required to sustain this vision. The forest consumed to heat the rooms. The armies of workers needed to maintain the illusion. The endless flow of money required simply to keep the lights burning. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Every morning, the house demanded coal, 40 tons per week during winter, shoveled by hand into steam boilers that fed radiators throughout 250 rooms. The heating system alone required a dedicated crew working in basement tunnels the public would never see. Above ground, the estate glittered. Below, it devoured. The staff numbered over 80 people during George's lifetime. Maids, footmen, butlers, cooks, laundresses, grooms, gardeners, foresters, farmhands. Each role was defined by rigid hierarchy. The house steward controlled the male servants. The housekeeper managed the women. They rarely spoke to each other except through formal channels. Servants lived on the top floors or in outbuildings. Their quarters were sparse. No tapestries, no carved limestone. Just narrow beds and small windows looking out over the estate they maintained, but could never truly inhabit. Their workdays began before dawn. Fires needed lighting, floors needed scrubbing, silver needed polishing. The house had 65 fireplaces, each requiring wood hauled from the forest, split, stacked, and lit before the family woke. In the kitchen, a French chef commanded a staff that prepared multi-course meals even when George dined alone. Food came from the estate's farms, 200 acres of vegetables, orchards, dairy cattle, pigs, and poultry. The goal was self-sufficiency, a fantasy of feudal completeness. But self-sufficiency is expensive. Running the estate cost roughly $250,000 per year in 1890s dollars. Today, that equals nearly $9 million annually, just to keep the place operating. Not to improve it, not to expand it, just to survive. And the house was never finished. Construction continued for years after that first Christmas. New wings, upgraded systems, endless refinement. George poured millions into the structure, treating it less as a residence and more as an ongoing artistic project. He rarely entertained. Unlike his Vanderbilt relatives, who threw legendary parties in their Newport mansions, George preferred solitude. He walked the grounds. He read in the library. He studied his forestry reports, The house had been built to impress, but George seemed increasingly disinterested in impressing anyone. In 1898, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She was elegant, cultured, and 12 years younger. Their wedding took place in Paris. They honeymooned in Europe before returning to Biltmore. Edith brought warmth to the estate. She involved herself in the local community, supporting schools and churches in the village of Biltmore, a small settlement George had established near the estate entrance to house workers. She also brought perspective. Edith recognized what George seemed unwilling to acknowledge. The house was unsustainable. Operating costs consumed his income. The Vanderbilt fortune, while vast, was not infinite. George's share of the family wealth generated roughly $250,000 annually from investments and dividends. That meant every dollar earned went directly into maintaining Biltmore. There was no cushion, no savings, no growth. The house ate everything. The forestry program, while idealistic, barely broke even. Olmsted's experiments in scientific farming produced beautiful results but marginal profits. The estate employed a village worth of people, but their labor fed the house, not the economy. Biltmore had become a closed loop, a system that consumed itself to survive. Then, in 1900, their daughter Cornelia was born. George now had an heir, someone to inherit this dream, someone to carry forward the vision of a Vanderbilt dynasty rooted in land rather than railroads. But inheritance requires survival, and survival requires money. By 1900, the American economy was shifting. The Gilded Age concentration of wealth that had enabled Biltmore's creation was facing political backlash. Progressive reformers called for regulations on monopolies and taxes on the rich. Labor movements demanded better wages and working conditions. The world that had produced George Vanderbilt was starting to erode. He responded by retreating further into his estate. He expanded the dairy operation. He built a school for the children of estate workers. He continued purchasing rare books for the library. He refused to acknowledge the coming storm. Meanwhile, the house continued its silent, relentless consumption. Every window needed cleaning. Every carpet needed beating. Every garden needed tending. The roof required constant maintenance. The limestone facade absorbed moisture and needed sealing. Decay is patient. The house fought it with labor, an army of hands performing endless, repetitive tasks to hold back entropy. Painters touched up walls. Masons repointed stonework. Carpenters replaced rotting wood. Permanence, it turned out, was not a destination. It was a war waged daily against time. The estate's 125,000 acres also demanded attention. Foresters marked trees for selective cutting. Crews cleared underbrush. Rangers patrolled for fires. The land was not wilderness. It was a managed resource, as controlled and cultivated as the house itself. Gifford Pinchot, the forester, had moved on to government service, but his successor, Carl Schenck, continued the work. Schenck even established the Biltmore Forest School in 1898, the first forestry school in America, training young men in scientific woodland management. George supported it fully, funding the school and providing the land. It was another expense, another drain, another piece of the vision that cost more than it returned. But it aligned with his philosophy. Biltmore was not merely a house, it was a demonstration, a proof that wealth could be wielded responsibly, that land could be preserved and improved, that beauty and utility could coexist. That was the dream, at least. The reality was more complicated. Workers on the estate earned modest wages. Housing in Biltmore Village was provided, but at rents that ensured George recouped his investment. The church George built for the village was beautiful, but attendance was expected. The school educated children, but they were educated to serve the estate. It was benevolent, perhaps, but it was also control. Biltmore functioned as a feudal domain in an increasingly democratic age. George was not merely an employer, he was a lord. His workers were not merely staff, they were dependents. This arrangement worked only as long as George's money lasted, and his money was not lasting. By 1910, George began selling land, not the core estate, but outlying parcels, acreage that was expensive to maintain and produced little income. The sales were quiet, handled through intermediaries, designed not to attract attention, but they revealed the truth. The house was winning. George could not sustain 125 acres and 250 rooms and 80 servants and experimental forestry and model farms and all the rest. Something had to give. He chose land. Better to shrink the empire than to lose the palace. But even that was not enough. The house still demanded coal, still demanded repairs, still demanded staff. The cost did not shrink with the acreage. If anything, they increased as systems aged and required replacement. George was trapped. He had built a monument to permanence, but permanence has no exit strategy. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington, D.C., following complications from an appendectomy. He was 51 years old. His death was sudden, unexpected, and catastrophic for Biltmore. George left the estate to his wife, Edith. She inherited 250 rooms, roughly 90,000 acres of remaining land, and operating costs that exceeded $250,000 annually. She also inherited a problem with no solution. George's estate was valued at approximately $10 million, but much of that value was tied up in Biltmore itself. The house, the land, the art, the collections. These assets generated no income. They only consumed it. Edith received investment income from the Vanderbilt trusts, but it was insufficient. George had been drawing down principal for years to cover expenses. The financial cushion was gone. And then, 5 months after George's death, World War I began in Europe. The war did not directly impact Biltmore, but it reshaped American society. Luxury became suspect. Displays of wealth seemed grotesque, while young men died in trenches. The social contract that had tolerated Gilded Age excess began to fracture. Edith recognized the shift immediately. She opened Biltmore to convalescing soldiers, offering the estate as a recovery facility. It was a generous gesture, but also a political calculation. The house needed to justify itself. It needed to demonstrate utility beyond mere opulence. The war ended in 1918. The soldiers left, the bills remained. Then came 1913's lasting legacy, federal income tax. Before 1913, the United States had no permanent income tax. Wealthy families like the Vanderbilts paid only property taxes and modest state levies. But the 16th Amendment changed everything. Suddenly, income was taxed. Investment returns were taxed. The strategy of living off capital gains while preserving principal became far more expensive. Edith watched her income shrink under the new tax regime. Meanwhile, property taxes in North Carolina climbed. Biltmore's 90,000 acres and palatial structures represented an enormous tax base. Local governments, eager for revenue, assessed the estate aggressively. Edith began closing rooms. The bowling alley fell silent. The gymnasium sat unused. Entire wings of the house were shuttered, furniture covered with sheets, dust gathering on marble floors. The staff was reduced. Dozens of workers were let go. Those who remained took on multiple roles, spreading thin across the vast structure. The house, once vibrant, became a tomb. Edith also faced a personal reality. Her daughter Cornelia was coming of age. Cornelia had been raised at Biltmore, a princess in a private kingdom. But what future awaited her? Who would marry into a family burdened with an unsustainable estate? In 1924, Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat and younger son of a noble family. The wedding was held at Biltmore, a lavish affair that briefly resurrected the house's former grandeur. But it was theater, a performance for the public and press. Behind the scenes, Edith was making brutal calculations. She could not maintain 90,000 acres. The forestry program, despite its idealism, lost money. The dairy operation barely broke even. The farms required subsidies. In 1914, shortly after George's death, the federal government approached Edith with an offer. They wanted to purchase approximately 87,000 acres of Biltmore's forests to create a national forest, ensuring the land would be preserved and managed scientifically. The offer came from Gifford Pinchot, George's former forester, now serving as a senior government official. It was a lifeline. Edith accepted. She sold the land for $5 per acre, roughly $435,000 total. Far below market value, but the sale provided immediate cash and eliminated the overwhelming cost of maintaining that acreage. That land became Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. It was George's legacy, preserved, but not by his family, by the government. The estate now encompassed only a few thousand acres surrounding the house, more manageable, but still expensive. Then came 1929. The stock market collapsed. The Great Depression began. Investment income vanished. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. The Vanderbilt trusts, which had seemed invincible, shrank dramatically. Edith's income from investments fell by more than half. Biltmore was now unsustainable by any measure. Rooms that had been closed were now locked. Staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. Maintenance was deferred. The house began to decay in earnest. Cornelia and her husband John moved into the estate, but even their presence could not reverse the trajectory. John brought no fortune. His aristocratic title held no currency in Depression-era America. They had two sons, born in 1925 and 1928, heirs to a crumbling empire. Edith faced a choice: abandon the house and let it fall to ruin, sell it, though no buyer existed for such a massive, impractical structure, or find a way to make it generate income. In 1930, she chose the third option. Biltmore opened to the public as a tourist attraction. The decision was radical. American aristocracy did not invite strangers into their homes. Privacy was sacred. Wealth was meant to be hidden behind gates and hedges. But desperation overrides decorum. Edith needed cash, and the house, however burdensome, had one marketable asset: spectacle. People were curious. They wanted to see how the other half lived, especially now that the other half was struggling like everyone else. There was a democratic satisfaction in touring a Vanderbilt palace, walking through rooms that had once been forbidden. The estate charged admission, $1 per person. Tourists came in modest numbers at first. The Depression limited travel, but those who could afford the trip made the journey. They walked through the banquet hall, gazed at the library, marveled at the indoor pool. They did not see the closed wings, the missing staff, the deferred repairs. They saw a fairy tale preserved, and they paid for the privilege. The income was not enough to restore Biltmore to its former glory, but it was enough to keep the lights on, enough to pay a minimal staff, enough to prevent total collapse. The house had survived by surrendering its privacy. George's dream of a private kingdom was over. In its place was something new, a public monument that funded itself through admission fees. It was survival, but at a cost. The estate was no longer a home. It was a museum, a business, a product. The transformation from private estate to public attraction did not happen overnight. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Biltmore existed in a strange limbo. Tourists visited, but the Cecil family still lived in portions of the house. Cornelia's sons grew up navigating the contradiction, residents of a home that was also a business. Edith Vanderbilt died in 1958, having managed the estate through the Depression, World War II, and the early Cold War. She had kept Biltmore alive through sheer determination and a willingness to compromise the original vision. Her grandson, William Cecil, inherited the responsibility. William recognized what Edith had known. Sentiment would not pay the bills. If Biltmore was to survive, it had to become more than a museum. It had to become an empire of its own, generating revenue from every possible source. He expanded aggressively. In the 1970s, William opened a winery on the estate grounds, capitalizing on the vineyards his grandfather George had planted. The wine was marketed as a luxury product, tied to the Vanderbilt name and the romance of the estate. It worked. The winery became profitable, drawing visitors who came for the wine and stayed for the house tour. William also opened restaurants, a hotel, gardens that charged separate admission. The estate began hosting weddings and corporate events, renting out spaces for private functions. Every room, every acre, every piece of the Vanderbilt legacy was monetized. The house itself was preserved meticulously. William understood that the estate's value lay in its authenticity, its ability to transport visitors to the Gilded Age. Restoration became a priority. Craftsmen were hired to repair stonework, restore tapestries, and conserve artwork. The house was no longer bleeding money. It was generating it. By the 1980s, Biltmore attracted over 500,000 visitors annually. By the 2000s, that number exceeded 1 million. Today, the estate employs over 2,000 people and generates more than $100 million in annual revenue. It is one of the most profitable historic house museums in America. But success came with compromises. The estate now features a Starbucks, a retail village selling branded merchandise, Christmas decorations that would have horrified George Vanderbilt, who preferred understated elegance. The house has become a brand, a destination, a carefully curated experience designed to maximize revenue per visitor. This is survival, but is it preservation? The rooms are maintained. The art is conserved. The architecture remains intact. In that sense, Biltmore has been preserved more thoroughly than most Gilded Age estates. Many others were demolished or fell into ruin. Biltmore stands because it adapted, but something was lost in the adaptation. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore as a retreat from the commercial world, a place where beauty and culture could exist for their own sake, free from market pressures. He poured his fortune into the estate not to profit, but to create something permanent. Today, Biltmore exists because it profits. The permanence George sought is sustained by the very commercialization he would have rejected. The house survived by betraying the dream that built it. Or perhaps that framing is too harsh. Perhaps the truth is more nuanced. George's dream was always unsustainable. No private individual could maintain 250 rooms indefinitely. No fortune, however vast, could fight entropy without end. By opening to the public, Biltmore found a new dream: preservation through participation. The house belongs, in a sense, to everyone who visits. Their admission fees fund its maintenance. Their interest justifies its existence. This is not what George intended, but it may be more democratic, more enduring. The estate also fulfilled George's other vision, the land. The 87,000 acres sold to create Pisgah National Forest remain protected, open to the public, managed scientifically, just as George and Gifford Pinchot intended. Millions of people hike those trails, camp in those forests, and benefit from that legacy. That part of the dream survives intact. Biltmore today is a paradox. It is a monument to Gilded Age excess that survives through mass tourism. It is a private estate owned by the Cecil family, but sustained by public fascination. It is a business disguised as a palace, or perhaps a palace sustained by business. The question of whether this constitutes success depends on what we value. If we value preservation of the physical structure, Biltmore is a triumph. If we value fidelity to original intent, it is a compromise. Perhaps the real legacy of Biltmore is what it reveals about permanence itself. George Vanderbilt believed wealth could buy immortality, that sufficient resources could freeze a moment in time and protect it from change. He was wrong. Immortality requires adaptation. Permanence is not stasis. It is evolution. The house survived not because it was invulnerable, but because it was willing to change. It consumed forests and fortunes. It demanded sacrifice from workers and owners alike. It nearly destroyed the family that built it, and yet it stands. The limestone glows in the morning sun. The gardens bloom each spring. Tourists walk the rooms where George once walked alone. The house is alive, still hungry, but it has learned to feed itself. That may be the most Vanderbilt quality of all. The ability to adapt, to find new sources of wealth, to survive through reinvention. Cornelius Vanderbilt built ships, then switched to railroads when railroads proved more profitable. George built a palace, then his descendants transformed it into a business. The family legacy is not permanence, it is transformation. Biltmore teaches us that history survives not when we lock it away, but when we find ways to make it relevant. The house lives because people care enough to visit, to pay, to participate in its preservation. In that sense, Biltmore belongs to all of us now, not just to the Cecils, not just to the memory of George Vanderbilt. It belongs to anyone willing to pay admission. That democratization is both the betrayal and the salvation. The cost of permanence, it turns out, is sharing the dream with the world. George built Biltmore for himself, but it survives for everyone, and perhaps that is a better legacy than he ever imagined. The story of Biltmore is not unique. Across America and Europe, grand estates face the same challenge: survive or vanish. Most vanish. Biltmore survived because it was willing to change, to open its doors, to become something its creator never intended. That tension between preservation and transformation defines every historic place. What should we save? What should we change? Who decides? These questions matter beyond Biltmore. They shape how we think about history, legacy, and what we owe to the past. If you found this story compelling, consider which other estates deserve exploration. The Breakers in Newport, San Simeon in California, Vizcaya in Miami. Each has its own struggle, its own compromises. Let me know in the comments which story you want told next. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the cost of permanence, subscribe for more explorations of the places where wealth, ambition, and history collide. History is never just about the past. It is about what we choose to preserve and what we are willing to pay for that preservation. Biltmore paid the price. The question is, was it worth it?